Hi, everybody. Lovely to see you. Good evening if you're in Australia. Good morning still if you're in the UK. It's great to have you all on this webinar. Actually, I'm talking to you from home because I've actually had COVID for the last week. I think currently 1 in 25 people in Oxford have got COVID. So it's very, very virulent, probably not unconnected with the fact that there are no restrictions in the UK about behavior, expectations, self-isolation, face masks or anything. So doubtless there will be high numbers, and that may be surprising to those of you who are logging in from other countries which are still under various COVID restrictions. But we've just finished the summer term at St. Antony's, life beginning to return to something that we remember from the pre-pandemic period. About half the students did their exams in the exam halls this year and put on their subfusk and had to handwrite for 3 hours, and we've just finished deciphering their papers, and the final exam boards will be next week. And the Hilda Best building has reopened, which is very exciting, and we're beginning to get used to the refurbished Hilda Best building. So good news from the college. It's great that life is, as I say, returning to normal. And it's brilliant, though, that we've kept the best of what we've learned during the pandemic, which is that we can do things like this, which is a podcast with colleagues on the other side of the world who can share their information and research with us. And we shall carry on doing this, I hope, well into the future. So I'm going to say just a couple of words about Tracy, who's then going to introduce Alan, but both of them, I'm sure, are very well known to most of the people who are on this call. Tracy did her doctorate in the early 2000s. She was supervised by Lawrence Whitehead and Tim Power, which must be the perfect combination for anybody working on Latin American politics. She's currently the Associate Professor in Political Science at the School of Politics and IR at the Australian National University and Director of the Australian Centre for Federalism. Previously, she was at the Latin American Studies Centre at the ANU, and before that, she was a postdoc fellow in the University of Saskatchewan. So Tracy, many, many thanks for joining us today. I think you said it was -3 in Canberra at the minute, but it's great to have you on the line, and I'll hand over to you to introduce Alan and today's talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roger. Yes, we're in our winter break, and our students do not do anything with pens and pencils, so all of our marking is online. So we do miss the traditions of Oxford. So I'm happy to be virtually back at St. Antony's. It's been quite a few years. And as an Antonian, I am very pleased personally as well that Alan Gamlen is now a professor in the School of Regulation and Global Governance at the Australian National University. So he's joined me here on ANU's campus recently. So Alan and I get to go to the pub and talk about Oxford. So it's kind of nice. Alan is an expert on human migration and mobility. He's held a numerous amount of prestigious appointments, which I'm not going to list all of them because there's too many. Importantly, though, however, in 2010 to 2020, so a decade, the Gamlen decade, he was the founding editor-in-chief of the journal Migration Studies, Oxford University Press. In 2016 to 2017, he was the director of the Australian Population and Migration Research Centre. Alan has also worked as a consultant and advisor on migration and migration policy to the World Bank and the Commonwealth Secretariat and the International Organization for Migration. He's also consulted various United Nations agencies and numerous national governments, regional agencies, and NGOs. He's also a high-level advisor to the United Nations Migration Agency and an advisory board member with the UN Platform on Disaster Displacement. Alan's book, Human Geopolitics, States, Immigrants, and the Rise of the Diaspora Institutions, Oxford University Press 2019, won the 2020 Distinguished Book Award for Best Book on Ethnicity and Migration from the International Studies Association. Alan is a member of the Tainui Federation of Maori Tribes in Aotearoa, New Zealand. He holds a doctorate from the University of Oxford, where he studied as a New Zealand Top Achiever Scholar. Most importantly, I'd like to introduce and talk a little bit about Alan's paper that he's going to present today. An important strand in Alan's current research agenda is about understanding the macro effects of the pandemic on human migration and mobility around the world. This is what he's going to talk about today. Specifically, he's going to give an update on a paper he wrote early in the pandemic for the United Nations Migration Agency called Migration and Mobility After the 2020 Pandemic, The End of an Age. The aim of this paper was to help set the UN Migration Agency's research agenda on the topic. It launched a new series produced by the agency featuring research by key experts on the unfolding impacts of the pandemic. This paper received quite a bit of coverage and debate in the media here in Australia and globally, and it featured on the front page of Canada's Toronto Star. Today, Alan is going to talk through a few of the major questions posed in that paper and report on the answers that have been emerged in the past 2 years since the paper has written. So with that, I will turn it over to Alan. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Tracy. Yeah, I too really delighted, honoured to be back in the room with Antonians after a hiatus of a few years. I can see the names of some people who I was lucky enough to go through my time at Oxford with. Roger was my, you've probably forgotten Roger, my college advisor when I was a doctoral student, and Tracy was my rowing coach. So I still have this Pavlovian reaction when being given feedback by Tracy. My heart rate rises, and yeah. So go easy on me, Tracy. I'll share screen. I've got a few slides. Can you see those okay? Yeah. They're showing all right. Oh, it's got movement. Or if I go like that, is it better? Give me a thumbs up.
That's perfect.
Yep. Okay, cool. Great. So as Tracy said, I just want to revisit this paper that I did in 2020 and kind of update and talk about some of the emerging data around human migration and mobility that addresses some of the questions that I asked in that paper. And at the center of it is really the question of, is there a long-term change in the way that people move around across borders and over space more generally? I guess a good place to start is to say that one of the most famous books on migration is called The Age of Migration by lead author Stephen Castles and his colleague. And Stephen was director of the Refugee Studies Centre when I arrived in Oxford at St Antony's. And that book, which is very famous, argues that post-war international migration is historically unprecedented in terms of its complexity, its global extent, the way that it's central to a wide range of social transformations, and so on. And that general interpretation of migration is supported by all the data. There really was a massive increase in the scale of migration after World War II, and particularly since 1990, as you can see here from UN Population Division figures. It wasn't just migration, but also short-term mobility that increased in that post-war period. For example, tourism climbed from 25 million arrivals worldwide in 1950 to 1.4 billion arrivals in 2018. And that was a 56-fold increase over that period. So we really were in an age of migration, and all of it came to an abrupt halt with the pandemic. There's probably never been a moment in history prior to this when the entire species has stopped moving at the same time. That halt covered all forms of human mobility, from walking to the shops, to commuting to work, to driving to the countryside, to visiting or moving to another country, in all the places where there were lockdowns. And most of the world's population, the vast majority of the world's population, was subject to severe restrictions on mobility during those lockdowns. So the flow-on effects of those disruptions to mobility encompass many of the main impacts of the pandemic, whether it's about the spread of the disease itself, the economic impacts of the disease through the closure of businesses and job losses, the impacts on things like transport infrastructure and planning, even areas like increases in domestic violence that happened early on during the lockdowns. A lot of those things, those central impacts of the pandemic, happened through the impact of the pandemic on mobility, through the changes to the ways that people moved around in space. And so the big question was, is this a temporary blip? Is this a kind of bounce back to normal, to December 2019 levels once the lockdowns are open? Or is there something more major happening? Are we maybe even beginning to see the end of this big post-war boom in migration? So first, let's try and get a handle on how migration has changed. It's still relatively early. There's a lot of data that isn't available. We'll know more as it is released. For example, the UN Population Division is releasing World Population Prospects 2022 in just a couple of weeks on the 11th of July. So look out for that these figures will be updated. But the evidence so far suggests that there has been a decline in migration that is unprecedented, at least since World War II. It's estimated that by the OECD that immigration to OECD countries dropped by over 30% in 2020 alone to about 3.7 million, which is the lowest level since 2003. So basically migration to the developed world has pancaked down to the level it was 15 years ago, 20 years ago. So major change. What's going on? Well, it's not just about the lockdowns, because as we know, as Roger said at the outset, they've lifted in a lot of places, but migration hasn't just bounced back to December 2019. So it's not just about the lockdowns, it's also about changes to the way people make decisions about migration. And those changes in decision-making differ according to the skill level of the person involved. So on the one hand, people who have more choice about migration, i.e. the highly skilled, are becoming less likely to move in many instances because after a severe crisis, we know that people become more risk averse. Research on earthquakes, for example, shows this. Migration is a very risky decision. So if you've got more choice about it, a time like now, where the risks are even higher, it is not a time where you would choose to migrate if you had the choice. On the other hand, the people with less skills, the lower skilled people, are becoming more desperate to move. And that's because the health crisis caused by the pandemic has turned into an economic crisis, or a series of economic crises, which has in turn exacerbated humanitarian crises and exacerbated the drivers of forced migration. So more people needing to flee terrible predicaments. So there's changes to the way that decision making is happening. It's not just about lockdowns. It's also about the way that labour supply and demand is changing. So back in April 2020, when I wrote the paper that I'm sort of updating here, the question in my mind was, will destination countries experience a decline in demand for immigrant labour? And at the time I predicted, yes, they will, because of an increase in unemployment. And since then, a number of people have said, but hang on a minute, unemployment's at an historic low, and demand for migrant labour is running extremely hot at the moment. It's massively increased since the pandemic, so you must be wrong. But I think it's important to note that's a really misleading way of looking at this. It's true that the labour market is in rich countries is much tighter than it has been for many years since the pandemic has happened. But that's not because demand has risen, it's because supply has fallen. In other words, the labour market's so tight because there are fewer workers around, and there are fewer workers around. A massive reason for that is because there's a lot less migration happening. There are, of course, other reasons, one of which is the withdrawal of many women from the labour market, partly as a result of the of school closures, so the way that labour is divided in households has changed. But lower immigration is a major reason for the lack of supply of labour, and that's what's driving what's happening at the moment. So the real question is, if borders had remained open and supply hadn't fallen, what would have happened to demand? And I think there's a clear answer to that question in these graphs on the slide here. Employment levels have declined as a result of the pandemic. They haven't bounced back at the level of the whole world, and in rich countries, which are the predominant receivers of migrants. And those lower levels of employment will translate into lower levels of demand for immigrant labour. So what's this led to? What has the impact of it been? And I just want to talk about two things briefly. One is, they're both really about changes to economic regionalisation. One is at the macro level, at the global level, and one's at the local level within cities. So in 2020, it was already clear that the reopening of border restrictions was going to happen selectively through travel bubbles and air bridges. And so the question in my mind at that time was, would the comparative ease of travel amongst countries sharing these selective reopenings lead to supply chain integration, which would then stimulate the formation of new economic regions? And certainly some of that economic regionalisation or re-territorialisation is happening. The front page of The Economist earlier on this month, a couple of weeks ago, was about reinventing globalisation, and it discussed exactly this, not in relation to human mobility, but the restructuring of global supply chains. It's talking about how countries are shifting from a focus on efficiency to a focus on resilience, pursuing vertical integration increasingly. So there's certainly a re-territorialization of the global economy going on, but not much within although that's widely recognized, there's not a great deal of discussion of the role of human mobility within that re-territorialization. So I think it's an absolutely key component, and we really need to be focusing on it more. Why? Well, this is a slide from a presentation by the International Civil Aviation Organization from 2 weeks ago. So this is very recent data showing that world passenger traffic has collapsed with an unprecedented decline in history. Even 2 years after the initial lockdowns, the total world air travel passenger volume is a fifth to a quarter lower than it was in 2019. Massive, even 2 years later. And an interesting aspect of that is that domestic travel has bounced back relatively better than international travel. The green line on this chart is showing the month-by-month passenger arrivals, passenger totals, sorry, volume totals, not just arrivals, for 2019. And the bars are showing monthly passenger arrivals ever since January 2020. The blue bit is international travel and the red bit is domestic travel. So that we've seen a weakening of international connections relative to domestic connections, which is important to this point about the restructuring of supply chains and the re-territorialization of the global economy. So what do I mean by that? Well, before the pandemic, we had a global economy that was predicated on relative stability, which translated into very easy global travel, very easy human mobility. That meant firms and governments could place their focus on efficiency in production and capitalize on comparative regional advantage by stretching out their supply chains globally. That meant making different parts of their products in different places according to where it was cheapest to make them. That's changed after the pandemic. We have a global economy that's increasingly predicated on on relative instability and relative difficulty of global travel, and that is leading firms to focus on security and resilience rather than efficiency, and that has meant capitalizing not on comparative advantage of regions, but instead capitalizing on comparative accessibility of regions. So a very key component of this restructuring of supply chains is the ease of mobility, I think. So that's what's leading to more geographically focused and regionally based supply chains. So the point here really is global travel has collapsed, might never be the same. The airline bosses are saying, and that's flown on to affect the way that we organize production and ultimately the spatial organization of the global economy, the way that we organize economically into regions. And that spatial reorganization is happening not just at the global level, but also at the local level within cities. Back in April 2020, the question in my mind writing this paper was, will new commuter patterns reshape cities? And there was a lot being written, a lot of hot air really about how the rise of remote work was going to drive an exodus from central business districts and lead to a flourishing of secondary cities and regions around major cities. But then there was also a huge establishment backlash to that trend, and with investment banks leading the charge to go back to the office. Clearly, there's a vested interest there because before the pandemic, the banks loaned billions to the property developers who built the skyscrapers, which are now sitting empty in CBDs. And so if those developers have to sell off inner city real estate at a loss, the banks tend to lose a huge amount. This is systemically risky. So there's a massive investment in the resurgence of CBDs. Despite all of this sort of talking, especially in 2020, about how remote work was going to change the world. So it'd be interesting to see how things are going. And the answer really is that from the point of view of the banks and the other back to the city advocates, not great. This is Google mobility data for the UK. And what the data shows is how community movement in specific locations has changed since the pandemic. Just ignore the pink line because this is mobility to public parks, and that's very seasonal. It's nice to go to the parks in some seasons and not others. Focus on the lines down the bottom, which represent mobility to visits to transit stations, workplaces, retail and recreation, and the like. So this is movement for work, shopping, and play. So all the essentials. And you can see early in the pandemic, it dropped off about 70%. And then started rebounding fairly quickly, but it's still in the UK between 10 and 25% lower than it was in 2019. So this is not a real bounce back. There's still something majorly different. If we compare that with Australia, where Tracy and I are, a similar or greater change in terms of use of transit stations. So there's still fundamental differences in the way that we commute when compared to pre-pandemic patterns. Again, the USA, 10 to 20% lower rates of mobility for work, shopping, and play than before the pandemic. 2 years really we still haven't really bounced back. What does this all mean? Well, I think it means this isn't a blip. This is not a temporary blip. Many of the questions and predictions that we were making back in the early days of the pandemic are regarding structural changes to human migration mobility are actually happening. They're happening at the micro level in terms of the way that people make decisions about migration mobility. They're happening at the macro scale in terms of the way that firms and economies demand immigrant labour. And those changes that are really happening are leading to major changes in the way that cities and the global economy are spatially organised. So back to the question of the outset, are we witnessing the end of the age of migration? It's probably too early to say yes or no. Migration has always been a thing. It's like when people say, oh, I'm pro-migration or I'm anti-migration. To me, it feels like they're saying, well, I'm pro-life or pro-death, or, pro-birth or pro-death. It's really one of these fundamental demographic realities that migration happens. So to talk of migration coming to an absolute end would be ridiculous. But I think that we are very likely, based on the trends we've seen to date, seeing the end to the most recent cycle of migration that has been underway since the end of World War II. So that's pretty major and worth keeping an eye on. I'll look forward to chatting more about it with you.
Thanks, Alan. That was an excellent paper, and it's a very interesting research agenda. You've updated a lot of things from the paper, so I have to admit that some of the things that I was going to push you on, I can't, because you've already answered. But I just wanted to go back to kind of where you started out the paper, because I definitely, as Alan said, we're in Australia, the context is quite different. And that in a way I actually think works as if Australia is an outlier, it's kind of a counterfactual to some of the things you're saying, in a sense, like a real counterfactual. So in Australia, we currently have an acute labor shortage. We have record low unemployment level, as Alan said, because of our border closures. So I was curious about the causal relationship between high unemployment and a depressed demand for immigrant labor. Because again, as you said, we have low unemployment here, but we have high labor sector demand. But because of the other factors you mentioned in your paper, which I think are really interesting, the migrant decision-making changes, anti-immigrant sentiment, restricted migration policies, and also the low levels of international student recovery, I feel as if the relationship or the significance of rates of unemployment, high or low, in determining migration flows may not be as constraining as the other mechanisms that you mentioned in your paper, being individual decision-making about migration or the so-called politics of migration, that actually haven't changed as much or everywhere in the post-pandemic context. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, even though there's huge demand in some countries like Australia for immigrant labor, even if we hold some of those mechanisms constant, the politics of migration and what you talked about in your paper, which you didn't mention in the presentation, but anti-migration sentiments, not really changed that much in the pre and post context. That's been quite constant. And so my question is actually not that exciting, because you mentioned lots of times in your presentation, but it's is this a blip question, or to question that again. And so as a political scientist, I'm obviously using different terms, but is the pandemic really a critical juncture for migration and mobility? And if it is, what are the choices? What are the actual choices being made now that cannot be altered in the future? Because only if the choice is being now in this kind of temporary space, if it's a critical juncture of a few years, the only way those choices equate to long-lasting impact on global migration mobility is if the choices we're making now can't be altered in the future. So I wanted to push you just a little bit more on what are the choices you think that are being made now that can't be altered in the future? Because if they can be altered in the future, then it is just a blip, because not all critical junctures equate to long-lasting change. That was it. Thanks.
Thanks, Tracy. And yeah, I feel like I should be erging while doing this and having you yell at me about my 500-meter split time. Thanks so much for those comments. Should I respond briefly before we let others join in? Is that the way you want to run it?
We don't have any questions yet, so maybe that'll get people.
Great. Yeah. So I guess the first part of the question is about how does the causal effect work with high unemployment and demand for migrant labor, and you know, your hypothesis is that it's the other factors that really matter more than the changing demand, than the changing supply rather. And this is a controversial topic, actually. So there's a long-standing debate in migration research about the relationship between the supply of migrant labor and wage levels in destination countries. Neoclassical theories tend to say that migration is driven by wage differences and it equalizes wages. So if there's a difference in wage levels between the origin and the destination, there will be migration between those two regions, and eventually, as supply matches demand, the wage levels will equalize and migration will come to a stop. But that's obviously quite controversial because it implies that the impact on wages in the destination country will be downward pressure, which is a factor that leads to ethnic tension. So this is a controversial debate, whether what's the relationship between the supply and wage levels, which has an impact on demand. So while there's been a lot of work that suggests the impact on wages is negligible, I think it would be, I think we would be hiding our heads in the sand if we were to say that a drop in supply as large as that which has happened during the pandemic has no effect on demand. So there's got to be some level of impact of just removing all those people from the labor force. That's got to be part of the explanation for why employers are crying out for more workers. Yes, there are other factors, and we probably need the data to have a look at what's the relative strength of those factors. But I think we'd be hiding our head in the sands if we were to say that a drop of more than 30% in 2020 alone had no effect in the OECD, had no effect on, isn't a factor in driving that demand. And then what are the types of decisions that are being made that can't be reversed? Well, there's very few that can never be reversed, but it's this case of things become path dependent, and they start to build up. So an example of that would be the decisions made by firms about hiring office space in central business districts. So a lot of firms hire office space on the basis of a 5 or 10-year lease. And they have to make those decisions with uncertainty about whether commuter traffic is going to bounce back. And a lot of them are simply deciding not to renew their leases. And they're saying, okay, we don't have an office, we don't have an HQ anymore. You can work from home. That leads to more people working from home, which leads to a respatialization of the cities in the way that I see it. There are a whole bunch of other types of decisions like that where firms and governments are needing to make decisions now that have a 5 to 10-year time horizon, which need to be made under conditions of uncertainty, and which therefore have to assume much lower levels of migration. So it's not that they're irreversible. It's just that they lock things in for quite a while. So I'll stop there.
We have a question from Ian Golden. If you'd like to turn on and make your question.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much, Alan. Wonderful to see you again, and to see you settled in your new position. and to hear your, as always, very insightful comments on migration. A couple of things that sort of come to mind as you posit this question as to whether we have a structural change which is permanent happening here. Firstly, I think what the pandemic has done is accelerate many transformations. It's accelerated the transformation to automation. It's accelerated the potential for hybrid work. It's clearly accelerated what governments do, but more broadly, the structure of economies. I think it's accelerated the move, some call the move from atoms to bits. I think about it as a move from manufacturing to massages. Increasing share of our economies being non-tradable services. It's also accelerated the demographic shift, the decline in fertility. If all of those things are true, one would expect a very rapid change, not only in the composition of labor forces, who does what where, but also in the composition of migrants, which would be long-term and structural. And I'm listening to your comments on that. My own sense is that we aren't anywhere near the end of migration, but that what we're seeing is a big change in who's going to migrate, for what jobs and the skills they need, coming out of that structural shift, particularly in the advanced economies, of what they need. It's also the case that within some regions, like say within the European Union, we have very rapid increases in migration flows. Look at the flows into Germany, for example, at the moment. And you see a very rapid response, which also, to me, suggests that part of what we're seeing is control mechanisms on migration, and that's particularly acute in the UK with Brexit, being the real reason why we're seeing much lower flows, is that the controls are much higher, and that where there's lower controls, as they are between European Union countries to other people within the European Union, we're not seeing that response. So that's a sort of counterfactual. I'll just run through a couple of questions I have. Your idea that the banks have my next book is on the future, is on spatial geography and inequality. So I'm very interested in this question as to what's happening for the future of cities. And I hadn't heard this argument, which you suggested, which is that banks have a vested interest because they are so indebted to urban housing, urban office stock, to get people back. Let me just suggest a counter argument, which is some banks have been very eager for people not to come back because they saw record profits in 20 and 21 through much lower costs, reducing, and you saw this record profits as well for legal firms and for many other professional service firms. Much lower costs, spending much less on hospitality, spending much less on office rental and heating and food and everything else in the offices, and actually encouraging people to be in low-cost locations and paying them less if they are in low-cost locations. That's certainly the case with some of the US institutions. So I'm interested in how those two different things play out. What share of banking exposure is to central CBD office space? And I would think it's a very, very small share of the balance sheet of banks. And I would not be surprised if other factors were not. I think, to me, the reason to bring people back are deeper reasons, like about productivity, creativity, how you do work, and whether you can do it remotely, rather than a simple instrumental reason about that they need the money. The final sort of set of questions in my mind is that you didn't refer to any of the other drivers of migration, which you've always talked about before. So we're living through the biggest development disaster most probably in history. More people being pushed back into desperate poverty than at any time in history, as a result of the combination of COVID and food and energy price shocks. That clearly must have an impact on migration. And if you look at the flows between African countries, for example, you begin to pick that up. The pressure on, for example, getting into some of the higher performing African countries. You didn't mention climate change, and I presume that that is going to lead to all sorts of new impetuses for migration, and already is. I mean, we every day we read about extreme events somewhere. Already presumably is pushing people around. And you didn't mention demography, which I think is the background shifter. Both the collapse of fertility in many countries, including many Asian countries, and of course the extreme youthfulness of most of Africa. How those things are likely to shape future migration patterns. So a lot of questions, but just things that you provoked, and as always, greatly enjoy being provoked by you.
Thanks so much, Ian. Yeah, and great to see you. I mean, picking up on your first question about, is this structural long-term? You said the word permanent, and so that gives me the opportunity to just once again reiterate and clarify, this is not a permanent end to migration. No, but I think it's quite likely that it's an end to, if there was a stable system or a relatively stable system of global migration after World War II. And I think there's quite a lot to suggest that that's the case, that was the case. I think that is probably come to an end, and we will see a period of turbulence. Again, exactly as you said, and as I say in the paper as well, that may involve massive increases of migration. It may involve turbulence, but it's the end to this current stable era, I think, probably, that characterized the post-World War II period. So it's just important to note the difference between saying the end of something, the end of migration, and the end of a particular system that existed for quite a while. On the issue of banks leading the charge, this is a really fascinating area. Of course, the behavior is different across different firms, different banks. Some banks have actually, been amongst those saying, yes, well, we can actually be much more nimble and competitive if we reduce our CBD footprint. That's true. What I'm referring to is that there's an enormous investment, including on the part of the banks, but sitting behind that, the pension funds and sovereign wealth funds in CBDs, massive investment. And it's driven by what you referred to as the need for agglomeration, or the perceived need for agglomeration in knowledge economies. So I remember a few months ago, I was in a meeting with the CEO of Transport of Infrastructure Victoria, so the state of Victoria, where Melbourne is based in Australia, and the head of the trains and tram lines in our state. And the CEO of infrastructure said, sort of rattled off, well, in the end, the CBD is definitely going to bounce back because of the returns to agglomeration in a knowledge economy. And that made me sit up and think, because I was like, that's actually 1990s, 1980s, 1990s economic orthodoxy. That's new growth economics thinking. We've been talking about virtual clusters for decades now. And I'm just not sure that it's actually true that we need agglomeration in order to have a knowledge economy anymore. And so this investment of governments, infrastructure, the big institutional investors through the banks is what's invested in getting people back to the CBD. It's not just that the banks, the portion of the bank's balance sheet which is exposed to commercial real estate, although I suspect that may actually be significant, and that'd be an interesting one to look at. It's the fact that there's this whole coalition which is dependent, absolutely incumbent as a result of their investment in the CBD. And then the final point, you mentioned some things that I hadn't brought up. Climate change. I would have liked to talk about climate change. This is actually an area where myself and some of my PhD students are increasingly looking at how that's governed, but it wasn't caused by the pandemic. I mean, obviously the way that we're responding to it is quite different now after the pandemic in many interesting ways. But yeah, just didn't really have time. Demography, though, was specifically mentioned in the paper, although I didn't have time to go into it in this talk. And, you know, there's fascinating stuff going on in there. I mean, at what point are the pension funds going to be offering lower premiums as a result of the higher mortality rate amongst the retired coming from COVID-19? You know, so how is this what? Another example would be how is the changed division of labour within households on a gender basis? So, for example, large withdrawal of women from the workforce. How is that going to change partnering, marriage and divorce rates and fertility rates? These are unanswered questions, but there's clearly something non-trivial going on, a few non-trivial things going on there. And I think the question, there really is a question of, will this event, this shock, lead to some shifts in the way that demographic transition is occurring around the world? Anyway, we can talk more, and I'll look forward to it.
Jenny, would you like to ask a question?
Hi, can you hear me? Yep, good. Okay, I might even manage to get my video going. Yes, okay. Hi, Alan, thank you very much. Really interesting paper. We somehow have failed to meet, even though I, like you, am sort of split between Oxford and ANU. So I look forward to opportunity to carry on conversation when I get back to the ANU. I'm currently in my Oxford phase. So I hope we'll have a chance to pick this up. I think my first impression is really this is a fascinating big picture story that you're telling, and fills in gaps in my own knowledge. I learned a lot from it. But I did want to pick up one point that you made, which relates to what Tracy said also in her comments, which is about the labour market effects of migration, and in particular the point that you were making about the debate around the impact on wages, and the fact that in a very sort of standard mainstream simple economic story is that migration is driven by wage differences, and that gradually then labour markets will equilibrate and wage differences will disappear. And while that is a reasonable, simple description of what one strand of economic thinking, clearly nobody thinks that that's a good description of the real world. And I think that that's quite important for the story that you're trying to tell. And I wonder if you've thought about looking at more sectoral data. So you've got an interesting story in your migration data that you unpacked a little bit for us about the difference between skilled and unskilled migration. And that is clearly going to be really critical to the story that you then tell about what parts of migration will pick up again and what parts may not. So I would urge you to go further and think then about the implications of that for wages and labour markets, because really what happens, and this is also part of economic thinking. So, we're not, as economists, we're not really so simple-minded as to believe that we're going to see global wage equalization. What we do talk about is wage relativities. So, the effect of immigration is to give you different relative wages between skilled and unskilled labor, and between labor in traded and non-traded sectors of the economy. And those differences will respond very much to migration, and importantly will feed into inflation in economies. So we are seeing that, you know, your point about labor market shortages is driving some inflation, but it's not as much as you might have expected in many economies. The United States is a bit different, but that, you know, the link between wages and inflation has changed apparently over the last 20 years, and it increasingly will be driven, I think, by these relativities, which will be linked to migration in complicated ways. But I think that's, you know, part of the story, and you can watch how that unfolds by looking at those wage relativities. And I think that from that point of view, Australia makes a really interesting case study, because, you know, the Australian economy is one in which the traded sector is relatively large, is large relative to the non-traded sector because of the importance of, you know, the mineral energy resource sector relative to other sectors of the economy. So we've got, you know, a case study with particular structure, and it's also an economy that's very dependent on openness and migrant labor, as Tracy pointed out. So it's a kind of one element of one interesting case study, but of course you wouldn't expect the impact of changes in migration patterns to be the same in Australia and in Japan, for example. You know, the Japanese economic structure is completely different, and its dependence on immigrant labor is completely different. So that sort of breaking things down into a more micro look, I think, can then help you interpret the macro story, because you know, you didn't talk very much about migration destinations, but you know, in addition to who migrates, it's where they go, which will change, and what effect that will have on economies will depend on the structure of the economies into which they're going. And so I think that adds richness to your story. The question I have for you is, what do you think the policy recommendations are out of this? I mean, what should policymakers care about as a result of the patterns that you're beginning to see? So thanks again for a really interesting paper.
Thanks very much, Jenny. Clearly we have a lot to discuss. And yeah, it's really wonderful to connect with you. And I look forward to connecting in person as well. You're right. I mean, broadly speaking, this is really just the tips of a few icebergs, and trying to set a bit of a grand narrative about the approach of a multi-year research agenda. So you're absolutely right. The detailed analysis, cutting data according to, you know, different sectors, different geographies, you know, different population groups and everything, that all that work is yet to be really done, and that's where the music will be really in this, isn't it? But at the moment, yeah, I'm at the stage of this research agenda of sort of broad brushstrokes. So you're absolutely right there, and take that criticism, needs fleshing out. Just wanted to kind of reassure you that I don't have such simplistic stereotypes about economists. You know, obviously there are many more sophisticated. I'm aware that there are many more sophisticated and varied economic theories of how migration happens and what its impacts are on the labour market and on the macroeconomy and so forth. And you know, the neoclassical story is, in fact, oversimplifying, but carries obviously, as is often the case, a grain of truth. And when we're looking at such a massive shift in supply and demand, it's got to move the needle a bit, right? I mean, obviously, since neoclassical theories of migration were really in vogue in the 1950s, there's been a lot of thinking, and kind of historical structural thinking was the next wave after that, and then the new economics of labour migration, talking about relative deprivation, how it's not inequalities between origin and destination countries, really inequalities in origin countries, and people sending a family member abroad to compensate for the lack of credit and insurance systems in their origin country. So send a migrant abroad to send remittances, which essentially is a form of insurance or access to credit. And then that mitigates risk, essentially, and allows them to move up the social hierarchy in the origin country with regard to their reference group. So it's overcoming relative deprivation rather than inequality between origin and destination country. And then there's a whole lot of network analyses about how the role of existing migrant groups and intermediary structures mediate those other decision-making factors and so forth. So it's a very complex story. All I'm saying really here is that that very simple classic Rolls-Royce model of supply and demand, there's got to be a moving of the needle when you're talking about a massive decrease in supply. The inflation story obviously is way more complex, and Paul Krugman is notably silent on these matters in the New York Times these days. I've noticed, after having spent quite a few years talking about how monetary stimulus, fiscal stimulus aren't going to, in the long run, affect inflation. He doesn't seem to be saying, he's very quiet on that front at the moment. But obviously, there's a lot of other things going on other than reduced migration and inflation. So I certainly wouldn't venture to say that migration is the major factor or even a major factor, and inflation is certainly going to be a factor, but there's just so much that's going on there with inflation. However, I think it is a major factor in the way that labour markets are working at the moment, or not working, some people say, and actually there's a great deal of research to be done there, and so that's why I'm pretty excited about this research agenda, doing exactly what you suggest, diving down into it and looking at the detail. It'd be great to talk with you more about it as it unfolds.
Alan, we're running out of time, but we have a quick question in the comments from Maurice about remittances, about whether if people are returning to using more informal mechanisms for remittances. And I don't know if you want to answer that here, or whether you could maybe answer it also directly in the chat to Maurice. And Hillary has her hand up. Hillary, I'll give you the last question. And if you could answer really quickly, that would be great.
Really quickly, I noticed Jenny's comment about comparing Australia and Japan. Now, as you can probably tell from the way I'm dressed, I'm in the top end. I'm in Darwin. It's pretty warm, although they say it's cold here because it got to below 20 last night. So there's a huge difference, for example, between Darwin and its circumstances, its migration, proximity to Timor-Leste, for example, where I was a couple of weeks ago, where you've got, what you would say was a classic push-pull, massive remittances, but really so many barriers in terms of visa processing and so on that classic system doesn't work. But really to highlight the old geography thing, change the scale and you change the issues.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Hillary. I'll reflect on that. I think you're right. And regarding the way, do I foresee a change in the way remittances are managed to continue or go back to informal ways of moving money? I haven't thought about it in depth, but I mean, we before the pandemic, we knew that remittances tended to be counter-cyclical. So when the economy went down, remittances went up, which was a great thing about them. You know, but because they insure people in times of difficulty. There was a fear early on in the pandemic that remittances would drop off drastically. They dropped off far less than was feared, but they still did drop significantly. I can't see, it would strike me as unusual if there was some sort of change to the formal financial system channels for remittances. All of the talk, all of the norms, all of the emerging infrastructure is to enable and reduce the costs, the transaction costs of remittances. I can't see that radically changing as a result of the pandemic. If anything, I suspect it might become easier. What I do worry about a little bit is the increasing reliance of aid donors and the like, and other organizations on remittances instead of doing their work. States and donor agencies say, oh, well, you know, wouldn't it be great if the migrants could just pay for their own home countries, and that way we don't have to do anything. I do worry a little bit about that, but it doesn't seem to me very likely that there'll be a massive systemic change in the way that remittances are managed, but who knows?
So thank you, Alan and Tracy, for being with us today. It's great to see you both. As I said in the beginning, this is a development office event. So I actually wanted to also make use of the opportunity to tell you about the initiative that we are taking at St. Antony's. And that is that we are aspired to offer a new scholarship from 23-24 onwards to students who have completed their undergraduate degrees in countries that receive official development assistance from the OECD. And this is part of our effort to to enable students to fulfill their academic potential, and particularly those from the global south. So if you can, it would be great if you could support this initiative at the level you are comfortable with, and I will make sure to follow up with the details in the next few days. So thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in person at the college, or perhaps at one of our in-person events at some point later this year. Thank you all.